Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And I've just finished a really interesting conversation with Basham, who's written a book called Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. And this book in particular is one that I could not put down. When I picked it up, it was so riveting. It was sad and dark and heavy because there are people that are listed in there and the connections they have to these secular progressive organizations and money that has been taken from these organizations, that it can be a difficult read. But I want to encourage my audience to pick it up and read it with an open mind, because there are a lot of people who are named in this book. And of course, as we discussed at the end of the podcast, not everybody who's named, is necessarily irredeemable, or that there's anything, they're not necessarily a wolf. But what Megan has really done in this book in a journalistic style is really report how things like the social justice narrative has overtaken the pro-life issue, how social justice language has been sort of applied to environmental activism, and how some secular progressive companies have funneled money into evangelical organizations to try to change the church's mind on these things and see environmentalism and things like that as a gospel issue. One particular highlight for me in this conversation was when she talked about the pandemic and how we were, as evangelicals, we were told to trust these people, trust Francis Collins, and really where the funding from all of that was coming from, and what does Francis Collins actually believe. And there was some really, disappointing stuff that she discovered with all of that, but it really made sense of why certain things were the way they were during those times. And I'm really hoping that this episode will be helpful for you, but I also hope you'll pick up her book, because she really, like I said, has receipts. She's chased all of the information down, and she has footnotes with all of this proven and documented, conclusively proving where a lot of this funding has been coming from, with things like the after-party curriculum, with some of the narratives around the pro-life and social justice issues, LGBTQ, critical theory, and all of that stuff. So really hope that this will be a helpful episode for you. Before we get into it with Megan, though, I want to let you know that I'm going to be speaking at the Share the Arrows event with Ali Beth Stuckey, also Rosaria Butterfield, and Abby Halberstadt in Dallas at Prestonwood Church on September 28th. Really, really excited about this conference. Excited to be with Ali and Rosaria and Abby. You can get tickets right now if you go to sharethearrows.com, and you can use my code Alisa for 15% off your ticket. I'd love to let you know about that. So if you want to come out and see us, you can register today, but don't forget to use that code Alisa for 15% off. All right, here's Megan Basham. All right, Megan Basham, I'm so excited to have you on the show. I've wanted to have you on for a really, really long time, because I've been following your work ever since you were just like this lightning rod a few years ago, talking about the money trail that you traced to some of these evangelical leaders that were spreading misinformation about things like COVID and all. So we're going to get into all of it today.
Yes.
But welcome. So glad you're here. Glad you've written this new book.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And I feel like I already told you, but I will tell your audience, I've been fighting a little bit of a cold. So I do have a cough drop in my mouth and water handy. So if I sound hoarse or have to cough, you'll know why.
And if there's a weird edit that you see on YouTube and you're like, why did they edit it right there? It might be because Megan had a coughing fit that we had to edit out.
It very well could be. I will say that's happened a couple times this week. So.
Yes. Well, as I said in the intro, when I started reading this book, I felt like I fell in love with reading again, because sometimes I just have to slog through books, and there have been some recently that I've really loved, but I could not put this book down. And it made sense of so many of the things I've seen in our culture with our evangelical leaders over the past several years. The first one I want to start by talking about is the environmental activism aspect, because this is actually something that I've had to talk about as I address the movement of progressive Christianity. And so in the 8 points, the original 8 points of progressive Christianity that go back to like 1997, this wasn't in there. But the one that's been up for several years, and even in the new one that they've changed, says that they strive to protect and restore the integrity of the earth. And that is something that's baked into their absolute fundamental values, which was always really confusing for me to figure out how to talk about that. Because, of course, I want to protect and restore the integrity of our earth, as I'm sure you do and everybody does. But there's more to it than that. So maybe start there, because this kind of was the first influx of some of those progressive ideologies that you kind of expose in your book.
And that is such a good point that you start this with, which is that the language is sort of manipulated to use something that you agree with, which in this case, I used creation care, and that's a term that you often hear.
I've
But we
used
all
that
were,
term. I've used it
yeah.
because I didn't realize that that was coming from where it was coming from. So yeah, continue.
So creation care is used in this not just environmentalist movement, but specifically climate change movement to say that Christians and you have actually seen this from some of these speakers at seminaries and things like that, saying that in order to be faithful to the gospel, you have to engage in creation care, which they then explains means being a climate change activist, lobbying for policies like cap and trade and the kind of fossil fuel regulations that make your gas more expensive and your groceries more expensive. And so that is really what you saw in the climate change movement within Christianity. And probably in that chapter, it was the one where I went back the furthest. Kind of went back all the way to the early 2000s, because that is when this really developed. And it was my opening chapter after the introduction, because it presented such a roadmap of how all of these kind of progressive issues have taken hold in the church, in the sense that you had these ecumenical groups that were not just Christians. Sometimes they involved left-leaning Christians like the Sojourners type
Yeah.
of people, but also Jewish groups, Catholic groups, all the progressive mainline groups. And they would join together to say, evangelicals are really a problem in terms of getting this particular policy across the finish line. So, how do we engage evangelicals on this issue? Because for those who may not be aware, evangelicals represent something like 25 to 30% of the American electorate, and they overwhelmingly vote conservative on almost all of these issues. So there was a real effort made. So a left-leaning ecumenical foundation created a front group in the Evangelical Environmental Network. And it got funding from all sorts of left-wing secular foundations like the Tides Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, lots of others. And essentially what it did was it created this organization and brought in leadership from places like Christianity Today, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. And the goal, as they say in their own literature, was to harness the influence of well-known evangelical leaders in the hopes that their views would then trickle down to the people in the pews, the rank and file. And over the years, you have continued to see those efforts made. Now, they have not been as successful as they wanted. So I would say in recent years, it's actually shifted to, instead of hoping to move evangelicals through top-down influence, they have pursued what they call a grass tops campaign, in which they're trying to get seminary students, people on Christian college campuses to speak up to their church leaders now and say, we want you to take up the issue of climate change. And to that end, they are getting their speakers in seminaries and on Christian campuses. And so all of this is not a move to say things like, let's reform our personal conduct in regard to the environment, say something like recycling, but in fact, to turn people into political activists on the issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I realized because, I've thought a lot about this. And even when I give presentations on progressive Christianity and I say, well, here's what they believe, it's always hard for me to talk about that point because I'm not sure. I think what your book helped me realize is like, okay, for example, I have chickens. We live on 5 acres. I keep bees. I care about, like the environment. I care about, I'm always telling people, don't mow your lawn, don't use pesticides, all these things. And we're looking into solar and all this stuff, and you mentioned you hate when they mow down the trees. And yeah, but it's like, that's not what they're talking about. They're not talking about being like, it's kind of like how the social justice conversation has infiltrated even things like homelessness. Like it's not enough for you to maybe even go help a homeless person, take them into your home, help them get a job. That's not what they're talking about. This thing it's kind of like feminism now, where it's like this systemic issue and it's all tied together. And you really pointed out, which was so eye-opening to me, how they're connecting environmentalism to the gospel. They're saying like, this is a gospel issue. Talk a little bit about that, because that can be, I think, very persuasive and deceptive for Christians who they want to live the gospel in all of these areas, but they've, like you said, hijacked the language and they're trying to make these things a part of the gospel message.
Right. And one of the examples that I gave has been Southeastern Seminary, which is a very large Southern Baptist seminary. And for those who aren't aware, Southern Baptist seminaries educate a plurality of pastors and ministry leaders in all denominations in the United States. So even if you're not Southern Baptist, what their seminaries are doing probably has a significant influence on your denomination, ministries that you are involved in. So they had been bringing in speakers to argue that that creation care means being faithful to the gospel. And in this presentation, for example, this was a speaker from an organization known as Arosha. And what he said was that because God created the earth, and that is the initial part of the story, the garden story and the redemption of the earth, we have a responsibility as Christians to care for the earth. And that is part of being faithful to the gospel. And the way that we show our care for the earth right now is ensuring that we are not having a negative impact on climate. And in fact, he actually referenced the negative population impact, his words. I would dispute that, but that a growing population is having a negative impact on the climate. And so really borrowing the environmentalist movement's framing of humanity as a curse on the earth rather than a blessing.
Right, right. So, and you also pointed out in that chapter how some of the policies that are accepted in this activism are actually really quite devastating to people in third world countries. Talk about that a little bit, because that's the thing I've noticed too, is that, yeah, okay, we can all agree we want justice. We want there to be, this or that. But again, hijacked language. And then there's no nuance as far as having an opinion on what policy might affect that, right? You have to toe the line with the kind of the progressive talking point. And so you pointed out that some of these policies have devastating impacts on people, poorer people in third world countries.
Right. So just last year, the National Association of Evangelicals, in partnership with some of these evangelical environmentalist groups, put out a report called Loving the Least of These, and it was focused exclusively on climate change. And the argument was to show love to the least of these, Christians must back these particular climate change policies. And they just kind of told terrible stories about disasters in the third world without presenting any scientific evidence that these disasters were something different than we have seen all throughout the history of the earth, but were specifically connected to human activity. They failed to show that, but they did have this string of, terrible stories. Well, to make the point that, look, there's very much another side of this story, I presented examples like Ghana. So it is a country that found massive oil reserves off its shore. It was coming out of its third world past. It was able to tap into those resources in order to create an entirely new energy infrastructure in its country that was really lifting it out of poverty. At that point, the World Bank got involved, and Ghana's leaders made a deal with the World Bank to adhere to the Paris Accord regulations. And essentially what it did is it required them to no longer use nitrogen fertilizer that was helping it develop crops to feed more people. It was no longer able to tap into those offshore oil deposits. And so all of that returned Ghana right back to where it started in its third world past, so that it wasn't lifting itself out of poverty. And when you talk about loving the least of these, how on earth could that not have been a part of the conversation? And you saw something very similar in the last decade in Sri Lanka, where they were developing farming technology, energy technology, and all of these things that were helping the local population so that they didn't need to rely on wealthier Western nations. And instead, those wealthier Western nations are kind of able to strong arm them into signing on to these Paris Accord regulations and other regulations like that. And it leaves them dependent, and it leaves them poor.
As far back as I can remember, I have tried to find the highest quality meat. I'm always looking for grass-fed beef with no antibiotics, no hormones. I'm looking for heritage breed pork. I'm looking for organic chicken. But then I discovered that GoodRanchers.com sells chicken that the standards are actually higher than the organic standards. And they have that same good grass-fed beef and heritage breed pork, wild-caught seafood. So, so good. And what I love about Good Ranchers is all of their meat is raised and harvested right here in the USA. So you're helping American American farms when you subscribe to Good Ranchers. And it's just so good. I get so excited when my box processes each month and that great meat is delivered to my door on dry ice, ready to be put in the freezer. Now, the summer games are right around the corner, and Good Ranchers has a really, really great gold medal deal for you. So right now, you can go to goodranchers.com and subscribe to one of their boxes, and they're going to give new subscribers a free gold medal add-on for the next 4 years. So what that means is that when you subscribe to a box, you can enjoy free plain chicken breasts, Angus ground beef, applewood bacon, or wild-caught seafood in every order for 4 years or until the next summer games. That's an amazing deal. And plus, with my exclusive code, you're going to get an additional $25 off your first box. So that's up over $1,200 in savings when you subscribe. So check it out for yourself. Go to goodranchers.com. Use my code Alisa at checkout to get $25 off your first box plus free express shipping and your free add-on for 4 years. Again, that's goodranchers.com. Use my code Alisa. So turning a little bit, I remember, gosh, this was probably maybe 15. Well, my daughter's 15, so this was probably 16 years ago. And I remember at the time, I think she was born. So this is probably more like maybe between 10 and 14 years ago. Whenever Russell Moore was the head of the ERLC way back in the day, when I was coming out of my faith crisis, when I was coming out of this progressive Christian paradigm, I remember discovering Russell Moore, and he had written this article on blood atonement and how, he's not going to let go of blood atonement. And that was really helpful to me because in the progressive paradigm, they were all saying that's cosmic child abuse and all this. So I thought, okay, this guy's good. I can follow this guy. But then I started to notice even all that time ago, there was a measles outbreak or something, and he was posting about vaccines. And he was saying every Christian must be fully vaccinated. You have to fully vaccinate your kids in order to be a good neighbor. And now at the time, I think I might have been pregnant Aiden was born, because I'm really bad with time frames, but Aiden was already born. So this is probably brain. Actually more like 10 years ago. Yes. And now I've got perimenopause brain, and that's even worse. So, so maybe 10 years ago, whenever that was. And I remember I was doing a lot of research on vaccines, trying to figure out what we wanted to do as a family. And I remember just feeling really strange about what he was saying, because I was thinking, well, surely there are questions that can be asked. Like there should be allowed to ask questions as a Christian about these things. And I'm not saying, taking a position either way on it, but at least there should be a conversation. But it was like anybody that would come in and challenge what he was saying, he would just skip over their comments and talk to the people who were agreeing with him, which was really, really odd to me. And I think that was the first time I realized, like, hey, there's more going on here. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the COVID stuff, because that was a very confusing time for a lot of Christians. It was confusing to me. I remember the mask mandates, and of course, I'm in Tennessee. We weren't really all that affected. They didn't do much here. It's kind of like you pretend to wear your mask until you sit down in the restaurant, and that was about all we had to do. But I know in other places, people were really forced to do some things that, again, shutting down churches, things like that. And you have got the receipts. By the way, anybody listening to this, anything Megan is saying right now in the book, it's all footnoted. There are receipts. She's proving what she's saying. She's not pulling this out of thin air. But chapter 5 was particularly provocative and informative for me. And it's how the government used pastors to spread COVID-19 propaganda. And this is really what put you on the map, I think, or at least what put you on my radar. So talk a bit about that, because this, I suspect, might be the hardest thing for some people to hear. But I just want to say, like, I understand, like, I followed a lot of these people back in the day and even benefited from the things that they were saying and from some of the things they were saying. But you have conclusively proven that there was a funding source that was progressive and not Christian, but aimed directly at Christians to try to change their minds on and to try to bring in some of these progressive policies. So talk a little bit about that. And I also want to ask you about the pushback on that, because that couldn't have been fun.
It wasn't. But, in a weird way, I have now, looking back, come to see COVID as something of a blessing for the church, in that I think it forced us to have some uncomfortable conversations that we were all avoiding, maybe a little bit feeling that being kind meant overlooking issues that were clearly developing and things that we felt uncomfortable with, and that, the best part of niceness was to not openly acknowledge it. Well, then COVID came along, and I think some of these issues were so stark that it could no longer be ignored. And what you just brought up with the COVID vaccine was certainly one of them. You saw Christian ministries, well-known outlets, Christianity Today, the Billy Graham Center, who was partnering formally with the CDC, since you brought up funding,
Mm.
and other organizations directly saying, to love your neighbor, you must get this vaccination. Now, as you said, we could argue about the COVID vaccines or any other medical treatment, but certainly if anything should fall under the heading of this is a matter of personal conscience, especially something that had just been developed that we did not know how it would impact, for example, women's fertility or how it might impact children or all of these things. It certainly should have been a matter where the church might give information on here's how you get vaccinated. But to say that being obedient to Christ, which
Mhm.
was something that some of them said, you must get this vaccine, was just the height of legalism to me. And that was where I think I could not write about it. I had recently taken a new job with the Daily Wire, and I was in a position suddenly for the first time in my professional life, kind of outside of the evangelical sphere. I'm still an evangelical, but I was now working for a secular media company for the first time in my life and could write about it. And really the way that all of these ministries presented this issue was through National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins. And
Oh.
if you're not familiar with him, he might otherwise be known as Dr. Anthony Fauci's boss. So at that time, he was presented as a faithful evangelical, a sort of Daniel figure
Yeah.
in the halls of Washington, D.C. power. And so he was brought onto all these shows with people like Tim Keller, Russell Moore, who you mentioned, Rick Warren, N.T. Wright, just many, many evangelical luminaries. And he was presented as this faithful brother who is not only a strong Christian, but a brilliant scientist. And because of that, we should listen to him. Well, not only did I have issues with his science and the authoritarian measures that the government was promoting in terms of shutting down churches for months and months on end while allowing things like literally strip clubs to stay
Yeah.
open.
Yeah.
Um, I also had issue with how Francis Collins was being presented by these character witnesses. So Francis Collins, in his role as director of the NIH, had overseen funding into research on aborted fetal parts. And it wasn't just something that kind of went on under his watch. It was something that he fought to maintain, which it's important to know that when you allow the demand for the aborted parts, it then, we know this from the free market, if there is demand, it will
That's
increase
right.
the supply. And so he was very clear during the Trump administration that he fought to keep that kind of research ongoing, to the point where there were some very gruesome experiments that were funded by his National Institutes of Health department that included grafting baby scalps onto lab rats,
Mhm.
and really abhorrent chimeric things. And then in addition to that, Francis Collins was also someone who, in his work as a government official, he would not say this, say on a Christianity Today podcast, but openly presented himself as an LGBTQ ally and
Yep.
spearheaded initiatives that included things like transgender experimentation on children, giving them cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, mastectomies to girls as young as 12. It also included some studies in which they tracked the homosexual activity of teenage boys without informing their parents. So things that it would be very difficult for any Christian to support. And yet none of this information was given to Christian audiences when they were told, here's a really strong believer like you,
Yeah.
and you should listen to this man when he tells you to get the vaccine. And I don't want to, ramble on and on, but I do want to make one more point about Francis Collins. And that was, for example, when he appeared on Christianity Today's live stream, he used that platform to tell lies that it later came out were not true, and that he knew at the time that they could very well not be true. And that included, he bluntly stated, this virus did not come out of a Wuhan lab, that nature created this. Well, we now know, based on records that have been released by Congress, that Francis Collins did know at that time that it was very likely that this virus came out of a Wuhan lab. So the idea that Christian ministries were being used to provide cover for the government's activities, potentially in funding gain of function research and that kind of thing, should be something that all Christians take pretty seriously.
Lately, we've done a lot of podcasts on the pro-life issue. This is something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is why I love 7 Weeks Coffee. 7 Weeks Coffee gives 10% of every sale to pro-life groups all over the country, and these are primarily pregnancy centers. And to date, they've raised over $400,000, and they are asking you to help them reach their goal to get to $500,000. They are a great partner to the show, and sometimes people ask, how can we support the show? One of the ways you can support this show is to buy 7 Weeks Coffee. And that pro-life ethic is right in their name, 7 weeks. At the 7 weeks, the baby in the womb is the size of a coffee bean. And that's when the heartbeat is first detectable. And I just love that 7 Weeks Coffee isn't just the highest quality coffee you can get, shade-grown, mold-free, low acid, pesticide-free, but they also support and partner with over 850 pro-life organizations. So why not buy some 7 Weeks Coffee, help them get to their goal of giving away $500,000. If you go to 7weekscoffee.com, you can use my code Alisa for an additional 15% off every order when you subscribe. Again, 7weekscoffee.com, use my code Alisa. And I remember just seeing post after post come down my newsfeed about him, like, what a great, we have this great Christian guy doing all these things. And then I learned about the abortion experiments. I learned about his, the pride and LGBTQ position. I'm thinking this guy is a progressive Christian, which, of course, I don't think progressive Christianity is Christianity, but that's the phrase that's used. But this is more like what I would expect to see in my research into progressive Christianity, yet people who are actually in charge of ethics for the entire Southern Baptist Convention, people who are otherwise respected evangelical conservative leaders are promoting this, and I couldn't figure out why. I was honestly just befuddled, like, why? And then your article came out that was about the money trail. So talk a little bit about that and the organizations that were set up to actually infiltrate evangelical culture with some of these progressive ideologies.
Yeah, and it depends on the issue because there are different groups for different issues. But one more point about Francis Collins until we move into that, I do want to say too that before these things were known about the research on aborted fetal parts and things of that nature, he also had some pretty wonky theology that should have thrown up some red flags, including not believing in a literal Adam and Eve, and one of those who doesn't take the accounts of Genesis literally. So I think he thought they were representative of some sort of hominids or something like that. So, he had some kind of very progressive ideas theologically as well.
Yeah,
so
because wasn't he involved with BioLogos? Is that right?
BioLogos,
He founded it. Okay, well, there you go. Yeah. Yeah.
So now in terms of the money trail on COVID, that was really the government partnership. I didn't really find any left-wing organizations funding that particular movement. But when you move into other issues like transforming Christian doctrine on sexuality and gender and marriage, that is very much an issue where there have been hard left foundations moving into the church, training activists to come in and try to surreptitiously move various churches and denominations away from sound doctrine. To give you one example, in the year 2000, a man named John Stryker founded the Arcus Foundation. And its purpose at that time was to help get, we have to remember this is pre-Obergefell. So its purpose at that time was to help get gay marriage laws passed in various states. But it was failing. Even in California, it was failing. So John Stryker gave an interview where he said, we realized that the problem was churches. We just could not get around churches. And so they determined to then reform church doctrine in order to help get these policies passed. So to that end, they started funneling millions of dollars into every Christian denomination, including Catholics and mainline. For example, they invested $3 million in just one United Methodist Church ministry. And if you've been paying attention, the United Methodist just went through a schism on the gay marriage issue. So you could say that money was well spent as far as Stryker was concerned. And so he's also been funding evangelical quote unquote ministries like the Reformation Project, for example, and its leader is a guy named Matthew Vines, who went viral some years ago for arguing, for example, that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is really speaking about a lack of hospitality, and that the other so-called clobber verses, as they put it, are about rape or pedophilia. They're not about loving same-sex relationships. So anyway, they have been funding the Reformation Project, and the Reformation Project in turn started partnering with a group out of Atlanta called Embracing the Journey, which gets funding from Andy Stanley's North Point Church. And it's gone into a lot of non-famous churches that you might know. But for example, some of the well-known churches it has gone into is, of course, Stanley's Church, North Point, and Saddleback on the West Coast. And so this curriculum is openly transgender and gay affirming. And on top of that, in addition to doing conferences with the Reformation Network, you will also see the Reformation Network partnering with Embracing the Journey to do educational conferences for young people in churches, for parents in churches. And they also have a program called Pastors in Process. And I believe the Reformation Project took it down after I released a story on it. But in fact, they even got it erased from the Wayback Machine. But I've got screenshots. And if you follow me on Twitter, I post them sometimes, the screenshots. But this Pastors in Process program, its purpose, its stated purpose, is to help affirming pastors quietly and confidentially move their non-affirming congregations toward progressive theology on sex and gender. So these are the kind of things you're seeing. And that same kind of funding coming from left-wing foundations, you can see on any number of issues. I also covered it in the immigration debate and how George Soros was part of helping create an evangelical front group to move the people in the pews on their voting when it comes to what's happening at the border. And so all kinds of issues like that.
Yeah, and you've done so much amazing work kind of exposing this. So when Andy Stanley started to kind of be more public about his slide into this more progressive theology with sex and gender, were you surprised, or did you already know all this, or did it make sense for you?
Well, when I first saw some of the testimony coming out about Andy Stanley's admissions privately, that he had been saying to other pastors in confidential groups, well, I might officiate a gay wedding if it were one of my grandchildren, and my theology has moved on this issue. I was a little surprised that he was stating it out loud, because it seemed to me that he must be coming close to a position of just openly acknowledging that he has moved on this issue. And I didn't know that he would ever get there. But when you got to the point where he was holding conferences at North Point Church with same-sex, quote unquote, married couples presenting to his church members, I think at that point, I was less surprised, because it was like, whatever Andy Stanley says now, you don't have wolves into your church to teach your sheep unless you have shifted your position.
I can hardly believe we're almost ready to start the school year again. It feels like we just ended. But many of you who are homeschooling are looking for a great Bible curriculum for your kids. I can't recommend Foundation Worldview highly enough. We've used this curriculum in our home, and they've just come out with a new one called God's Good Design. What a great time to help equip your kids through 30 video-based lessons on God's good design for things like identity, gender, sexuality, marriage, and family. And these lessons are really easy to implement. There's just not a lot of guesswork. You just print the activity sheet, plus press play on the video. And this includes multiple activities per lesson that engage children's minds and bodies with biblical truth. So you're going to cover topics that you might be intimidated to bring up to your kids. Let Foundation Worldview help you with God's Good Design curriculum, because you're going to cover topics like image-bearing, gender, love, friendship, marriage, family, sin, transgenderism, abuse, pornography, homosexuality, divorce, and redemption. Those are some deep topics that they they will come alongside you and help you so that you as the parent will become the first one to cover these sensitive topics with your children and becoming the expert in their eyes. So I can't recommend this highly enough. Parents become proactive in their approach rather than waiting to be reactive once children are exposed to sinful distortions of God's good design in culture. So go to foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa for 10% off of any family license that they offer. Again, foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa. And, so much of this affects, we have, one of the things I'm really concerned about is we have like these, what we call big Eva, right? They're the big evangelical platforms. These are the people who are leading us. They're telling us what to think about things. And a lot of Christians really trust them. In fact, you tell the story of your childhood pastor who didn't even realize that Christianity Today had kind of been sliding more liberal. Tell that story, because I think that will relate with so many people who just aren't keeping up with all of this. They're like, well, Christianity Today, that's supposed to be this great, representing Christians, but it really, for a while, has been sliding very progressive. It's not hard to see that when you pay attention to it on a daily basis, but if you haven't read an article in 5 or 10 years, you might miss that.
Right. And it's so strange to think about that this is Billy Graham's magazine, known as the flagship magazine of evangelicalism. And, when I was a kid, every pastor we had and knew, you'd always see it in the church offices. So, yes, I got an email from my dear pastor, Randy Brannon, from when I was growing up in the San Joaquin Valley in California. And he asked me, is Christianity Today going woke? And when I saw the text, I laughed because I went, man, okay, how long has it been since you read Christianity Today? But it did kind of set me off going, well, how many people don't know? And they aren't aware that when you look at Christianity Today's political coverage, they will cover issues like gun control, climate change, immigration from a very progressive point of view. But what they have not been covering are, for example, all of the red state laws that we have seen being passed in the last couple of years that ban doctors and hospitals from providing transgender, I don't like the word treatment, so let's say procedures, transgender procedures to children that have been outlawing gender indoctrination in classrooms and things of that nature. And they don't cover that at all. So one, there's a subtle going, okay, so obviously a certain kind of news is being preferenced here. But then on the other side of this, when I went looking for hard receipts, because it's one thing to say, I sense it, it's something else to demonstrate with some sort of hard citations what's happening. I found that between 2015 and 2022, which at the point that I wrote the story was the most recent that I could access, they had made, CT staffers and board members and executives had made 74 political donations in the course of those years, including the news and editorial staff. And all of them went to Democrats, every single one, including some very hard left candidates like Elizabeth Warren for her presidential campaign. Their news editor contributed to her. And I assume everyone's familiar with Elizabeth Warren, but you don't get more liberal than Elizabeth Warren to the point that she has pushed to shut down crisis pregnancy centers. So that was one piece of the puzzle. And that was who was coming into Christianity Today. Another piece of the puzzle was who is Christianity Today taking money from? For example, they now get millions of dollars from the Lilly Endowment, which is the foundation started by the Eli Lilly pharmaceutical company. And they're not just getting it to do things like, if we were saying minister to the needy in some way, which I think you can understand if Christian organizations were to partner with secular foundations in some way to say, okay, we're going to, I don't know, distribute lunches to children or something like that. It doesn't do that. Its purpose is to provide a training program for pastors on their preaching. So it is to shape the content that we see in churches and the teaching that people in the pews are getting. And it's really important to make that distinction. And it does the same thing with a lot of progressive religious groups. It gives money to, all kinds of seminaries and I'm going to put Christian in quotes, Christian campuses that are very hard left, openly affirming the kind of schools where you will see rainbow flags and BLM flags flying. So these are all kind of parts of the puzzle of what happened at Christianity Today. And it's really emblematic of what we've seen happen to so many Christian institutions that, we used to know and trust. And it was interesting to me that he just wasn't aware. And I'm glad that he told me, because it sparked for me this desire to go, okay, people need to see real hard reporting on what's happening there rather than the people who are in the know just grousing on social media, which is
Yeah.
what you tended to see.
Yeah. And one figure that seems to be sort of popping up in all of these, well, not all of them, but in many of these conversations is Russell Moore, who now is he the editor in chief of Christianity
Correct.
Today? And then, of course, now he's got this new curriculum for churches just before the election called the After Party, and it's marketed as if it's this sort of it's nonpartisan, it's neutral, it's meant to encourage Christians to just be biblical in their view of politics. That's the marketing of it. But obviously, a lot of people, myself included, were thinking, no, there's more to it than that. So talk about the after party curriculum and where the funding for that is coming from. Well, first tell us what it is, and then where the funding is coming from.
Yeah, I can tell you that Russell Moore, perhaps of any figure in my book, looms largest
Mm-hmm.
because he's so frequently involved with so many of these organizations. For example, the Evangelical Immigration Table, which has been involved with George Soros funded programs. He was a big driver in that. He's still involved with that program. And you brought up the after party. And so the first thing that makes me chuckle a little bit about this curriculum that's going into churches and they're holding conferences and it's being brought into college campuses, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities sent out an email back in August to all of its 185 member schools, including schools like Biola, telling them, get prepped to use this curriculum.
Mm.
You should use it in your ministry classes. You should distribute it to your students. So just really sort of going, here's all the different ways you could use this curriculum on politics. And the idea that it's nonpartisan, let's start with who created it. So Russell Moore, who is a well-known and confirmed never Trumper, David French of the New York Times, who is also a well-known and confirmed never Trumper, and a guy named Curtis Chang, who is a Duke Divinity professor, a Democrat, and a well-known never Trumper. So as far as nonpartisan, it really does not have a broad swath of political representation in
Mm-hmm.
who was creating this curriculum. And then you go to who was funding it. So when I asked them about it, they at first they demurred, and then a Tim Alberta book came out where he mentioned they were not able to get funding from fellow Christians. And he just kind of dropped a little line that they had to then go to secular funders. At that point, I did a little digging. And you come to find out that the entire program is being funded by hard left secular foundations like Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, which also funds things like the Gender and Reproductive Justice Initiative or something like that. So its purpose is to ensure that youth have access to transgender procedures
Mm.
and to help protect abortion. It was also funded by the Hewlett Foundation, which is the second largest funder of Planned Parenthood in the country. So really hard left secular foundations. And when they announced this curriculum to their audience, not to church audiences, they noted that it's going to be unrolling in the battleground state of Ohio. So it seemed like they had an awareness that there's a political purpose for this curriculum. And I watched through all the curriculum. It's a series of videos and you kind of answer some questions. And it's very subtle, but the upshot of it is that politics are very complex and Christians can never be sure how they should vote or what party they should support. And in particular, when they're making that point, when David French is saying, if anyone tells you he knows how you should vote on some particular issue, you should run from that person. And on the screen, as he's saying this, it shows a pro-life protester holding a pro-life sign. So the visual suggestion there
Mm-hmm.
is that the people who are telling you that you should vote for a particular party or a particular candidate who is promising to outlaw abortion, well, that's not necessarily something that as a Christian you have to listen to. And, maybe there are other ways that you could be pro-life, including through social justice. And then on the other side of the coin, there is one issue that this curriculum made very clear that Christians should vote on, that they are conscience bound to support with their vote. And that is the issue of systemic racism, that we have to vote to address systemic racism. Well, so while they don't boldly say, here's who you should vote for, these little indicators make it very clear who they're suggesting you should support
Of
in this
course.
curriculum rolling out during an election year.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, this to me, just the manipulation, the gaslighting, and we see so much of this, like so many things that come down my social media newsfeed are, it's like our friend John Cooper says, what is it? Lean left, punch right, right? That's kind of
Right.
what a lot of these progressive leaning, quote unquote, evangelical organizations and people are doing. It's like leaning toward the left, like, yeah, the left is really the more compassionate people. As I love how Allie Beth Stuckey calls it, toxic, is it toxic empathy? I think her book is
Toxic empathy. Yes.
Toxic empathy. That's a great line because that's kind of what it is. It's like this narcissistic compassion, I think, that Jordan Peterson talks about, leaning left, punching right. And that seems to be the common thing. It's like, oh, yeah, we want to be nonpartisan. We want to, and then the way they'll characterize the things, it's very clear which side they're on. And I see this over and over again. And that's why your book was so helpful to kind of give language to what I already saw, but I didn't know there was a money trail. I didn't know that all of this, was existing. But you mentioned pro-life and how that's sort of been co-opted by social justice. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit, because that's a big one. If you, in today's climate, just on social media or something as a Christian, you say, well, I'm pro-life, and then somebody's inevitably going to say something like, oh, Christians only care about getting babies born. They don't care about what happens after people are born. If you're truly going to be pro-life, you have to be against the death penalty. You have to be open borders. You have to be all this stuff. And you really kind of lifted the lid off that and demonstrated how that sort of social justice language has co-opted the pro-life movement. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what you have seen, particularly after the Dobbs decision came down overturning Roe, a lot of the people who had sort of staked a never Trump position suddenly were saying, well, what we have to do now, rather than just openly celebrating, look, we now have a chance to fight. And obviously, there's been some setbacks and that fight needs to happen. We need to make the argument and we need to demand recognition by our political parties. And I encourage everyone to continue that fight.
Yes.
But it at least made a way for us to battle both nationally and on a state level for new abortion regulations. And instead of celebrating that, what you saw was so many evangelical leaders, including Russell Moore and Beth Moore and the author and columnist Karen Swallow Prior and many others, saying, well, what we have the opportunity to do now is put in place a greater social safety net so that women will not want abortions. Well, one, I have an issue with that already because as we see all throughout biblical history, there is always a satanic impulse to kill our children.
Yes.
And in this era, it's to the God of convenience. So the idea that simply expanding the welfare state is going to make women stop seeking abortion is simply not borne out. For example, when we look at what the policies of the Johnson administration have done, particularly in the Black community, they did not have that effect. We have a large welfare state there, and all it has done is decimate marriage within the Black community. So I fail to see why expanding it further would have any different impact on the rest of America and American women. But so what they did at that point was start to say, all of these other things also count as pro-life. Things like what our border policy is, what even climate change. They have said, well, if climate change has a negative impact on our weather and the weather is creating disasters and that's taking lives, well, now climate change has become a pro-life issue. And what you really see with that is that we don't do that with any other issues. We don't say, for example, with the Me Too movement, well, could Me Too also mean I was treated badly at a job because of my skin color, so Me Too? Well, no, it means something specific. And so when you do that, what you do is dilute the power of the term so that if it means everything, it essentially means nothing. And that was the argument. And to me, the reason that argument was made, and you saw it by so many, was because of who made Dobbs possible. And you don't have to like Donald Trump. You don't have to support Donald Trump. But the reality is, the political reality is, he did appoint the justices as he promised who would overturn Roe v. Wade. And I think that that was such a problem for those who had staked such a position on evangelicals selling their souls to vote for him,
Hmm.
that they could not give him that credit. That, yes, if nothing else, you kept your promise on appointing those justices. And that was why we saw such a rush to redefine what pro-life meant.
Mm, mm. Man, I think about all the corruption that you have exposed in the church, which it's hard, it's painful, it's heavy. But whenever we shine light on things, it's good, right? It's good even though it's hard. And I'm curious, what motivates you? Because it has to be difficult for you to be kind of in the crosshairs of people who really don't want you to be saying the things that you're saying. And you're sort of in the position where you are ticking off both sides, right? You're ticking off the progressives, but also the evangelicals who may have people on a platform that, maybe it's a good reminder that we shouldn't be putting people on a platform and that humans are inherently sinful and everybody's not going to always make the right choice or right decision. What keeps you going? What motivates you to do this as a wife and a mom? I mean, you're really putting yourself out there.
One, I lean on my husband a lot. He's always like, maybe don't state that quite that way, or he's just my constant counselor. But I don't know. To be honest with you, I'm like, maybe God just made me this way.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
it doesn't really bother me. I don't quite know why. And I feel like by the time I started writing about these issues, I had been seeing so much of it and it was bothering me so much that when I had the opportunity and I was given the green light at Daily Wire, it was like I could not
Mm,
write about it. I was so pent up at
mm,
that point
mm-hmm.
that I just had to work on this subject. And that Francis Collins story, the one that blew up and kind of made me go viral and put me on the map, no one knew I was writing that. I hadn't asked for permission. I hadn't pitched it to my editors. It was like I had just been listening to podcasts from all of these Christian leaders that I at one time esteemed and trusted. And it was bothering me so much without even realizing it. I just started like jotting down timestamps. And suddenly I was working on a story and it took me a couple of weeks in my off hours to get this story done. And at one point I was like crying to my husband, no one's going to care about this. I don't know why I'm doing it. And then when I finished, I brought it to my editors at Daily Wire. And I think for all of us, it was a little like, ooh, you're going after some specific pastors and ministries here. And, understandably, they took a minute and said, okay, we need to think about this for just a minute because we're about to maybe cross a Rubicon here. And to their credit, after it sat on my boss, Jeremy Boring's desk for a couple of days and he thought it over, he went, you know what? Yep, it's newsworthy. It's legitimate. Let's run it. And I'm so grateful that they did. And since then, I've had moments of a little bit of depression, when the attacks are coming, but I maybe it's just grace that I'm like, it doesn't really bother me much. And I have such a good support system at home. And my husband, he's kind of the coach who's always like, who cares? And
Yeah.
I think that's so encouraging. And part of it too is he's like, if this goes away tomorrow, so what? And I'm like, that's a good point. So what? I go back to exactly how life was before. And it's not like anything's particularly painful.
Yeah. Well, you're a truth teller. You're one of those people. I relate when you say I couldn't not I had to write it. I couldn't not write it, and I relate with that. And I love that you're such a truth teller. I'm wondering if we could give maybe some practical thoughts to the church, because this is going to be obviously a very difficult book for some people to read. I mean, there were names that were in this book that I kind of winced and was like, oh, not them too. And I think as I thought it through, one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is that you're not condemning everybody who may have, been unintentionally affiliated with something, even if their name shows up in the book. I mean, nobody is beyond redemption and repentance and all of these things. And it's my prayer. And honestly, maybe I'm overly hopeful, but it's really my prayer that maybe some of the people who find their names in this book might go, gosh, I really need to just make a public statement repenting of that and turning from that. Maybe they were affiliated with a company that maybe at the time they didn't even fully realize was being funded by these people, but they realize it now and it's time to speak out and make a public statement. I mean, people would, I think, respond really positively to that. But what thoughts might you have about just the average person? Like, let's say they've got this pastor they just love, and then they find the name in the book. What's your heart behind hoping to help them process through the information that you're presenting?
Well, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because just because I, in a repertorial journalistic fashion, mention what happened with someone doesn't mean I'm saying this person is a wolf, or you should
Hmm.
never listen to this teacher, or this teacher is completely disqualified. I'm not saying that. In some cases, I'm simply reporting what happened in what was going on in some of these institutions. And we're all fallible in many ways. So let's start there. So I think we can distinguish, and I said that in the introduction, that I think there are some wolves here that are pushing some of these things.
Hmm.
And I'm going to leave it to the readers, because I can't read hearts. But I think as you read the book, it becomes evident without me having to label people who they are, where there are many, 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 many people who just got caught up in things. And teachers I still love and listen to, where I went, man, I wish that you hadn't got caught up in that cultural influence that I believe was unbiblical for reasons I explain. But I don't think that one flaw means we throw that person out,
Yeah.
and that one mistake. So, that's one. But on the other hand, I also want to empower church members, given everything that's going on, to also hold our leaders accountable
Yes.
respectfully and graciously. Because I think when some of this had come in, I think if there were a little more willingness to have an uncomfortable conversation, maybe it would have been arrested. And I opened the book with this story of a friend who, he and his wife went to a number of churches where, in particular, the CRT and social justice gospel was being pushed in some pretty egregious ways. Like, he was in a Bible study group where he was told, you as a white man are not to speak for the first 6 months. You are just to sit and listen. And there's just nothing biblical about that.
Right.
And other stories where, people had um, Bible study groups in their churches segregated by skin color. So when I start there, he later told me that he went to a church that was starting to kind of drift in that direction, and he thinks maybe the pastors were well-meaning, but he went to them, and after a course of lunches and coffees, he was able to convince this pastor, "Hey, I don't think you understand, the root ideology behind these things and where it's coming from." And the pastor heard him, and he
Mm.
now teaches some Bible studies on these kind of ideologies and why they don't align with a biblical worldview. And it's a really happy ending story. And I love those stories. So that's another thing, is I just want to tell people, maybe let's start with the uncomfortable conversations, and we avoid going this far down the road. But for those who are the clear wolves, I mean, if you
Yeah.
have people bringing in false teaching, if your church is suddenly bringing in LGBTQ affirming curriculum, or
Yep.
holding conferences, in that case, you need to leave that church, and you need
Yes.
to stop giving that ministry leader attention. And we just need to be clear that that is a marked wolf. And we're no longer going to treat that person like a brother because they're teaching false doctrine.
Yeah. Well, one thing I really appreciate about your approach in this book in particular is that it is very neutral in the sense that you're reporting facts. You're just like, this is what happened. These are the people that were involved. But when you do bring it around to, what you might say to something, you always bring it to Scripture. And I so appreciate that about this book, is there's a lot of Scripture in the book of just kind of helping the church as we read it to remind ourselves of what God has revealed about these things. And we're living in a time where there is so much celebrity. There are these platforms that seem like they have so much power, and it can feel like you're the crazy one if you're the one who is saying, well, that doesn't seem right, but this huge evangelical platform just said I'm supposed to think this way, and it can feel very confusing. And so I'm very thankful for your book, for what you've brought out in the church with that. I want to leave you with the last word. Anybody who's listening, and maybe this is all new for them and it might feel a little bit overwhelming, what would your word to them be?
Um, I kind of developed a talk that I give now sometimes from material in this book. And my favorite story that people bring up to me a lot, for those who've gotten early peeks at it, is in the 19th century. there was a period of time when Charles Spurgeon and Karl Marx were both kind of heavily influential in London. And there was always a question of why did Marxist ideology not take hold in London the way it did in other areas of Western Europe. And I first heard this story from my friend Larry Taunton. And of course, I went and checked it, and it's true, and found the original source documents. But Karl Marx's co-author of the Communist Manifesto was asked, "Who do you hate most in the world?" And his response was Spurgeon. He hated Charles Spurgeon most in the world because the belief was that Charles Spurgeon's preaching was so influential and powerful in England that it managed to reveal the counterfeit gospel of Marxism. And that to me is so encouraging that the way really to combat these ideologies, since you brought it up, is simply to just preach a powerful, powerful gospel and to show these worldly philosophies for what they are, and tear down those kind of arguments. And that's just so inspiring to me. I want them to say, "Who do you hate most in the world?" Megan Basham.
Yes, I love it. I love it. Well, I want to thank my guest, Megan Basham, and I thank God for Megan Basham. I want you to pick up her book, Shepherds for Sale. It is a watershed book. I mean, this is going to be a bombshell in the church, and I just want everybody to pick it up and read it. Also, we're going to continue our conversation and going to have a little bit more of a chat with Megan on our Patreon group. If you want to join us over at Patreon, go to patreon.com/Alisa Childers. It's different tiers that you can select there, but you can join us for monthly live streams on Facebook. We do all sorts of little fun things in our Patreon groups. We'd love to have you join us. And again, let's remember as we pursue Christ to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.